The frozen wilderness stretches before you, a vast, unyielding expanse of white that seems to swallow up everything in its path. The air is thick with an icy bite, the kind of cold that doesn't just chill your skin, but sinks deep into your bones, making each breath a struggle against the relentless chill. The night has fallen early, as it always does here, in the far north of the world. The sun, when it rises, barely skims the horizon before sinking back into the earth, leaving behind only the cold and the darkness. Now, imagine that you are a Viking, a member of a fierce and resilient people whose reputation for survival and conquest has become legendary. But survival here, in these frigid northern lands, is not about swords or shields. It's about enduring the harshest conditions nature can throw at you. It's about the chill that permeates every part of your body, even when you're inside the protection of a shelter. The brutal cold, the biting winds, and the ever-present darkness are not enemies that can be fought with strength alone. In this unforgiving world, survival becomes an art, a delicate balance between mind and body, between strategy and sheer willpower. The Vikings, however, were no strangers to hardship. They were shaped by it, honed by centuries of living in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Their legends, their raids, their conquests, all were the result of generations of learning how to survive and thrive in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. But what if I told you that the Vikings had discovered a way to survive the cold nights, not by relying solely on fire, the traditional method for keeping warm, but by a hidden technique, something far more ingenious and subtle? This method was not something written down in books, not something shared openly in tales. It was a survival secret passed down through generations, a subtle, almost mystical understanding of how to stay alive when the world around you seemed intent on freezing you to death. The cold here is not just a physical discomfort, it is an ever-present threat to life itself. The nights are long, and without fire, without warmth, the cold would claim you. And yet, the Vikings survived, even thrived, using this hidden method. It is tempting to think that fire would be the ultimate solution to the cold, and indeed, fire was central to Viking life. But in the dense forests and rugged terrain of the north, fire was often scarce. The wood required to keep a fire burning was not always easy to find, and the cold winds could snuff out flames faster than you could gather more fuel. This meant that fire, as important as it was, had limitations. To truly survive, to endure the freezing nights without fire, required something more, something deeper, something woven into the fabric of Viking culture and ingenuity. As you lie there, huddled against the cold, in a Viking longhouse or perhaps a simple shelter made of sod and wood, you begin to understand that the Vikings' survival methods were not merely about brute strength or resourcefulness. They had learned to listen to the land, to understand the subtle signs of nature, to work with it, not against it. They understood that warmth could be found not only in fire, but in the careful use of materials, in the design of their shelters, and in the very clothing they wore. It was a sophisticated method, one that did not rely on the obvious, but on the hidden secrets of nature. For the Vikings, survival was not an individual pursuit, it was a communal effort. The longhouse, where several families lived together, was designed not just to keep the cold out, but to trap and retain the warmth generated by bodies and small fires. This communal living, while practical for warmth, also forged a bond between the people. It was a bond that made survival possible in a world where death was never far away. The warmth of the fire, the warmth of the community, was a shared experience. In this shared warmth, the cold was kept at bay. But beyond the shelter and the communal fire, there was a deeper method, a more personal approach to survival. It lay in the way Vikings dressed, the layers of fur and skins they wore. The animals they hunted and tamed provided not just food, but materials for clothing that were perfectly suited to the cold. The thick pelts of reindeer, bears, and wolves were more than just clothing, they were tools of survival. Worn in specific ways, with layers upon layers, they created a barrier between the body and the cold that was as effective as any fire. These garments, meticulously crafted and carefully maintained, allowed the Vikings to survive the nights without ever needing to light a flame. As the cold creeps closer, as the winds howl through the gaps in the shelter, you begin to feel the true power of these survival methods. The furs press against your skin, their weight comforting and protective. The layers of wool and fur trap the heat of your body, creating an insulating cocoon that keeps the chill at bay. The Viking way of surviving the cold was not a passive act. It was an active one. It required attention to detail, an understanding of how materials could be used to hold heat, to create warmth where there seemed to be none. It was a technique born of necessity, but one that showed a deep understanding of the world around them. This was not just a matter of physical survival. It was a matter of mental endurance. The Vikings, in their struggle against the cold, were also testing their limits, not just of their bodies, but of their spirits. They faced the darkness, the cold, the isolation of the northern night with courage, with determination. They were not just surviving, they were enduring. They were adapting, learning, and growing stronger with each passing season. As you settle deeper into your shelter, wrapped in the warmth of your furs, you can feel the Viking spirit alive within you. It is the spirit of survival, of resilience, of never giving in to the cold. The technique they used to survive the freezing nights without fire was not just about staying warm, it was about embodying the very essence of the Viking way of life, unyielding, resourceful, and strong in the face of overwhelming odds. In the end, the Vikings' hidden method of survival, their way of enduring the night without fire, was more than just a technical solution. It was a testament to their ingenuity, their connection to the land, and their unwavering will to survive. As the long, cold night stretches ahead, you realize that survival in this world is not just about fighting the elements. It's about understanding them, mastering them, and using them to your advantage. And so, as the night deepens, you fall into a peaceful slumber, knowing that you are part of a long line of people who faced the cold and conquered it, not with fire, but with the quiet strength of their own ingenuity. The world of the Vikings was one shaped by harsh realities, a land where nature itself seemed to conspire against the survival of its inhabitants. The lands they inhabited were rugged and remote, where the earth itself was hardened by freezing winds, deep snow, and a relentless, biting cold that would break even the toughest of spirits. In this frozen expanse, the people lived close to the land, and it was here, amid the long winters and short, fleeting summers, that the Vikings carved out their existence. The Northlands, as they are often called, are not a forgiving place. The chill that blankets these lands is not the gentle coolness of a mild winter, but a suffocating, all-encompassing cold that invades every part of life. The winds sweep across the frozen terrain with the force of a hammer, cutting through the thickest of furs and stripping the warmth from the bones of those who are not prepared. The days are short, and the nights stretch on, seemingly endless. The northern sky, when it isn't covered in clouds, is often a dim gray, as if even the sun is reluctant to brave such a bleak and uninviting landscape. Here, the Vikings learned to not just survive, but to endure, mastering the harsh climate as only a people born of such a place could. The Viking homeland, known as Scandinavia, is a land of extremes. The winters are long and brutal, stretching from October to March in many regions, with temperatures plunging well below freezing. In the highlands, the cold can be even more intense, with snowdrifts reaching as high as the roof of a house, while the coastal regions, battered by storms and winds, offer little respite from the cold. The environment is unforgiving, and life here is a daily struggle against the elements. The challenge was not just to stay warm, but to find ways to make this harsh land habitable for oneself and one's family. For the Vikings, the cold was a constant companion. It was an enemy that could not be reasoned with, only fought. Every aspect of their life was influenced by the weather. The construction of their homes, the clothing they wore, the way they hunted and gathered, all of it had to be adapted to survive the ever-present chill. But beyond the physical challenges, the cold also shaped the Viking mindset. The cold made them tough. It taught them how to endure hardship and how to adapt to a world that offered no warmth except what they could create with their own hands and willpower. The climate in the northern regions of Europe, where the Vikings made their home, was not always harsh, but it was unpredictable. Summers, though short, could bring warmth and fertility to the land. The long daylight hours of the summer allowed the Vikings to work the land, to hunt, and to prepare for the inevitable winter. However, the seasons could change swiftly. A summer storm could wipe out crops, and an unexpected cold snap could freeze the ground and make travel nearly impossible. The ability to survive in such a land was not just about enduring the cold, but about being prepared for the sudden shifts in the environment, to understand that the warmth of summer could give way to the deadly chill of winter in an instant. As the days shorten and the cold begins to take hold, the Vikings would retreat into their longhouses, the heart of their communal life. These homes, constructed with wood, stone, and thatch, were designed to withstand the freezing temperatures outside. The walls were thick, often lined with straw or animal skins for insulation, and the roofs were sloped to prevent snow accumulation. But the longhouses were more than just buildings. They were symbols of the Viking way of life. Inside, the family and the clan gathered around the central hearth, where fire was a constant presence. It was a place of warmth, light, and community. Here, in the safety of the longhouse, the Vikings could escape the cold, at least temporarily. But even here, the cold was never far away. The fire that crackled in the hearth was a fragile thing, easily extinguished by the winds that could sneak in through cracks and gaps in the walls. Without the fire, the cold would invade, and the shelter would no longer be a refuge but a tomb. It was this precarious balance between warmth and cold, life and death, that shaped Viking society. The cold was not just a physical challenge but a constant mental and emotional strain. The Vikings had to be resilient not only in their actions but in their minds. They had to learn to live in harmony with the cold, to work with it rather than against it. In a world where fire was often the only barrier between life and death, it was essential to find ways to keep the cold at bay, even when the fire was not enough. The Vikings' struggle against the cold was not just a matter of survival, it was a matter of pride. The cold became an adversary that they could not afford to lose against. The warmth of fire, while important, was not always a guarantee. In times of need, during storms or long journeys, the Vikings had to rely on more than just flames to survive the night. The clever use of furs, animal skins, and natural insulation was essential. It was not enough to simply wear warm clothing. They had to understand the way heat worked, how to trap it, how to layer it in ways that maximized its effectiveness. The Viking way of life was about understanding the natural world in a way that was deeper than mere survival. It was about respecting it, learning its rhythms, and using its resources to their advantage. The challenge of the cold shaped the very foundation of Viking society. It influenced their work, their home life, their culture, and even their beliefs. In a place where the cold could so easily take life, survival was not just about the tools they used, but about their relationship to the land. It was about understanding that survival depended on more than just strength. It required knowledge, adaptability, and an unyielding will to persevere. This struggle against the cold was not only a practical one. It became a defining feature of the Viking identity. The cold represented not just the challenges of nature, but the harshness of life itself. It was an enemy that could break even the most determined souls, yet the Vikings learned to stand firm against it, not by fighting it head-on, but by outwitting it. They adapted, they endured, and they ultimately thrived in a land where few others could survive. The cold was a formidable foe, but it was also a teacher, showing the Vikings how to become something more than mere survivors. It taught them how to be resilient, resourceful, and strong in the face of nature's fiercest challenges. In the end, the cold was not just a force to be feared. It was a force that the Vikings learned to master, using every resource at their disposal to turn it into an advantage. They understood that survival was not just about fighting the cold, it was about understanding it, respecting it, and finding ways to coexist with it. And in doing so, they turned the harshest of environments into a place where they could not only survive, but thrive. Fire is an ancient and primal force, a symbol of warmth, life, and safety. For the Vikings, it was nothing short of a lifeline. In the dark, freezing nights of the Northlands, fire was the ultimate weapon against the cold, the single element that could stave off death. It was a beacon of hope in an otherwise brutal landscape, and yet, even this powerful force had its limitations. Fire, as crucial as it was, could not always be relied upon. The winds of the north could be so fierce that they snuffed out flames before they had a chance to spread warmth. The wood that provided the fire was often scarce, especially during the long winter months when it was hardest to gather. Even the best kindling, carefully collected during short bursts of sunlight, could sometimes fail to ignite, leaving the Viking settlers in a precarious situation. When fire was unavailable, the cold would creep in, slow and insidious, threatening the lives of those who depended on it for warmth. The Vikings, however, did not have the luxury of surrendering to the elements. Fire was essential, but they knew it was a fragile resource, and their survival depended on finding ways to make do when the flames couldn't be summoned. The winter months in Scandinavia were a test of endurance, and fire alone was not always enough to guarantee survival. In the colder, more remote regions of Viking lands, firewood was a luxury. The forests, which during the warmer months were teeming with life, became treacherous when covered in snow. The trees, their bark thick with the weight of frost, were harder to fell, and the snow piled high on the forest floor made it difficult to reach the wood that could be used to keep fires burning. In times of storm or snow, it wasn't just the difficulty of collecting firewood that posed a danger, it was the fear of running out of fuel in the middle of a long winter night. The Vikings, ever resourceful, were acutely aware of this vulnerability. They were masters of survival, not because they relied solely on fire, but because they learned to adapt and use their resources wisely. The struggle for warmth was constant, even when fire was present. A small flame in the hearth could offer comfort, but it could never be counted on to heat an entire longhouse, especially when the cold winds swept in through cracks in the walls or under the door. The wind itself could freeze a flame in an instant, reducing a roaring fire to nothing but smoke. And yet, in these moments of vulnerability, the Vikings were not defeated. Instead, they became experts in using fire wisely, stretching its power and making it last as long as possible. They understood that warmth could not always be created, but it could be trapped, preserved, and conserved. A carefully maintained fire could help them weather the night, but it was the ability to retain and preserve heat that truly made the difference. To survive in such a harsh climate, the Vikings had to become experts not only in making fire but in keeping it alive. They would often sleep near the hearth, where the warmth could offer comfort, but it was not just the fire itself that mattered, it was how they managed the heat, how they used their limited resources. Fire, though crucial, was a luxury that could not always be afforded. There were nights when the cold would settle in so deep that it seemed as though the hearth itself was a mere illusion. On those nights, when the wind howled outside and the snow piled high against the walls, the fire could feel more like a memory than a reality. This is where the Vikings' ingenuity truly shone. They had no choice but to develop techniques that allowed them to survive without the constant reassurance of fire. When fire was unavailable, when wood was too scarce, when the wind threatened to blow out the last ember, the Vikings turned to their knowledge of materials and the natural world. They were masters at layering clothing, building shelter, and understanding the way heat moved through the body and the environment. In essence, they had learned to use the cold to their advantage, not only adapting to it but finding ways to thrive in its presence. One of the Vikings' greatest strengths was their ability to make use of the materials that nature provided them. They understood that fire was not the only way to stay warm. There were other, more subtle methods of heat retention. Animal skins, for example, were an essential part of their survival. The Vikings used the furs of reindeer, wolves, and other animals to line their clothing and shelters. These furs acted as natural insulators, trapping the heat of the body and keeping the cold at bay. It wasn't just about wearing one layer of fur, it was about layering, understanding how to create an impenetrable barrier between the body and the outside world. The thicker the layer, the more heat it retained. The Vikings used these materials with extraordinary efficiency, understanding the properties of each type of fur and skin, and knowing how to use them in the most effective way. In addition to fur, the Vikings also understood the power of shelter design. Their longhouses were built to maximize heat retention. The walls were often constructed with thick layers of sod, which acted as both insulation and protection from the cold. The roofs were steeply pitched to allow snow to slide off, reducing the risk of heavy buildup that could cause structural damage. Inside, the warmth generated by a small fire was carefully preserved, with the heat radiating outward, warming the walls and the air. The layout of the longhouse, with its central hearth and communal spaces, helped to concentrate the heat in the areas where people gathered. The Vikings knew that even the smallest fire could warm an entire group when the heat was carefully managed. The reliance on fire and the realization of its limitations forced the Vikings to look for other ways to stay warm. They turned to their understanding of the land around them, using its resources in ways that others might have overlooked. They knew the properties of various woods, for example, and how to use each type to create the longest-lasting embers. They learned how to create warmth not just from fire but from the very air around them. They created windbreaks, built their shelters into hillsides to block out the wind, and used snow to their advantage, packing it tightly to form barriers against the cold. The struggle for warmth was a battle fought on many fronts. It wasn't just about having enough firewood or lighting a flame when the temperatures plummeted. It was about understanding the relationship between fire and cold, about knowing when to light the fire and when to rely on other means of heat retention. It was a dance between the two elements, a delicate balance that the Vikings mastered over time. Fire was the tool, but it was not the only weapon in their arsenal. They had learned that survival didn't come from one solution alone, but from a combination of methods, strategies, and a deep understanding of the world around them. As the cold crept ever closer, as the dark winter nights grew longer and the fire threatened to falter, the Vikings knew they had more than one tool at their disposal. They had learned to survive without fire, not because they lacked it, but because they had developed a deep respect for its limitations. They understood that to truly thrive in the frozen north, they had to be as resourceful as the land itself. And so, they became masters of adaptation, using their knowledge of fire, materials, and the natural world to ensure that the cold could never fully claim them. The Vikings, ever the pragmatists, understood that survival in the harsh northern climes required more than just the ability to make fire or huddle together for warmth. While fire had its place, the true secret to enduring the cold was found in a method that did not rely on flames at all. In a world where the cold could seep into your bones and the fire could easily be extinguished by the cruel winds of the north, the Vikings developed a hidden technique, a survival strategy that was as ingenious as it was subtle. This was not simply about warming the body through external heat. It was about mastering the elements in such a way that the body itself became an instrument of survival. The key to this hidden method lay in their understanding of insulation, and more specifically, the strategic use of materials that could trap and retain body heat. The Vikings had an intimate knowledge of the natural world, and they understood how to use what the land provided to create a barrier between themselves and the biting cold. The simplest, most fundamental tool they had was their clothing, but it was not just any clothing. The Vikings wore layers upon layers of furs and skins, crafted in ways that maximized their insulating properties. This wasn't mere protection, it was a carefully designed survival system. The furs they wore were not just for show, nor were they simply a means of keeping out the chill. They were the Vikings' own personal heat traps, designed to hold the warmth generated by the body and prevent it from escaping into the icy night air. The clothing was built to work with the body's natural processes. The Vikings understood that to stay warm, the body needed to be kept insulated, but it also needed to breathe. The furs and skins allowed for this delicate balance. By layering different types of materials, the Vikings created a multi-layered system that could keep them warm without causing them to overheat. The fur-lined hoods, the thick woolen tunics, and the heavy cloaks were all part of this intricate system. Each piece of clothing worked together, trapping the heat within while allowing the body to maintain its natural temperature. The layers weren't just about warmth, they were about preserving the body's internal heat, keeping the cold at bay even in the dead of winter. But clothing alone was not enough. The Vikings knew that the cold could creep in through every crack and gap, no matter how well insulated they were. The shelters they built were just as important, and their design was rooted in the same principles of heat retention. Longhouses, the iconic Viking homes, were built with materials that not only provided protection from the elements but also helped to trap the warmth inside. The walls were thick with layers of sod, which acted as a natural insulator, while the roofs were steeply pitched to allow snow to slide off easily. The floor was often made of packed earth or stone, and the small hearths inside were strategically placed to create the most warmth. The structure of the longhouse itself was designed to create a cocoon of warmth, where the heat from the fire could be trapped and circulated throughout the space. The design of the longhouse was a perfect example of Viking ingenuity. The longhouses were built to withstand the cold and the wind, but they also took advantage of the natural heat generated by the human body. The Vikings often lived in extended families, with several households sharing a longhouse. The proximity to each other created a communal warmth that helped to mitigate the cold. The bodies of the Vikings, working together, created a natural heating system that was both effective and sustainable. Even without the fire, the shared warmth of the group was enough to keep the cold at bay. But what happened when fire was unavailable? What happened when the wind howled outside, and the cold seemed to invade every corner of the shelter? The Vikings had a backup plan, an ingenious method that allowed them to survive even the most bitter nights without flames. They used their understanding of body heat to their advantage, creating shelters that maximized the heat generated by their own bodies. These shelters were not merely places of rest, they were carefully constructed heat traps that would keep the cold at bay even when no fire burned. One such method involved the use of sleeping bags made from animal skins. These sleeping bags were not just simple covers, they were works of art, crafted with precision to retain heat. The skins, lined with fur on the inside, created an insulating barrier that would trap the warmth of the body and hold it in. The Vikings would often sleep in these bags, wrapped tightly, using their own body heat to create warmth that would last throughout the night. This was a method of survival that was as practical as it was effective. The sleeping bags became a cocoon of warmth, a small, intimate space where the cold could be kept at bay even in the harshest of conditions. In addition to these sleeping bags, the Vikings also used a variety of other materials to insulate their shelters and keep the cold from penetrating. They would use moss, straw, and animal hair to line the walls and floors of their homes, creating layers of insulation that helped to trap the heat inside. The thicker the layer, the more heat it could retain. These materials were often gathered from the land around them and were chosen for their natural insulating properties. The Vikings didn't just use what was available to them, they used it with purpose, understanding that the right materials could make all the difference in their ability to survive. The Vikings' ability to survive without fire was not just a matter of necessity, it was a reflection of their adaptability. They had learned to use what was around them to stay warm, and they had developed a deep understanding of how the elements worked. They didn't just rely on one method or one material, they used a combination of strategies to ensure their survival. They knew that the cold was not something to be fought head-on, it was something to be outsmarted. By using materials in ways others might have overlooked, they were able to create an environment where the cold was no longer an insurmountable enemy but a challenge that could be overcome. The key to the Vikings' hidden survival method was not just their ability to create warmth but their ability to preserve it. The cold was a constant threat, but the Vikings had learned to manage it in ways that ensured their survival. They used the materials at hand, they worked with their environment, and they developed strategies that were not just practical but elegant in their simplicity. The Vikings were masters of survival because they understood that life in the north was not just about enduring the cold, it was about learning to coexist with it, to work with it, and to use it to their advantage. And so, through ingenuity, resourcefulness, and a deep understanding of the world around them, the Vikings developed a hidden method of survival, a method that allowed them to endure the freezing nights without fire, without flames, and without fear. Their mastery of the cold was not just a testament to their strength, it was a testament to their ability to adapt, to survive, and to thrive in a world that offered little mercy. The relationship between the Vikings and the animals that roamed the vast, wild landscapes of Scandinavia was not just one of survival, but of deep, symbiotic connection. To the Viking people, animals were not simply creatures to be hunted for food, they were vital to their way of life in every sense. They provided sustenance, materials, and, perhaps most crucially, the very warmth that allowed the Vikings to survive the bitterly cold nights of the northern climes. Among all the creatures that the Vikings relied upon, the fur-bearing animals, particularly reindeer, bears, and wolves, played a central role in the survival of the Norse people. These animals, whose pelts were thick and insulating, became the cornerstone of Viking clothing, shelter, and warmth. The fur of these creatures was no mere luxury. It was essential to the Vikings' ability to withstand the freezing temperatures. As the long, harsh winters of Scandinavia pressed in, the need for warmth became more critical than ever, and the Vikings had honed the art of using animal furs to their advantage. The fur of the reindeer, for example, was prized for its exceptional warmth and durability. The animals that roamed the frozen tundra provided the Vikings with a material that was perfectly suited to the cold. Reindeer fur was not only dense but also highly effective at trapping air, creating a barrier between the body and the cold outside. The Vikings crafted tunics, cloaks, and hoods from this prized material, layering it to maximize its insulating properties. The process of preparing these pelts was a labor of love and necessity. After a successful hunt, the Vikings would carefully skin the animal, ensuring that the fur remained intact. They would then treat the pelts to preserve their softness and durability. This was no simple task. The skins had to be dried, tanned, and oiled before they could be used in clothing or bedding. The preparation of these furs became a crucial skill, passed down from generation to generation. It wasn't just about keeping warm, it was about turning nature's raw resources into something that would keep them alive during the long, frigid nights. Bears were another key source of fur for the Vikings. The thick, luxurious pelts of the bears that roamed the forests were sought after for their warmth and comfort. Unlike reindeer, which were often hunted for their hides and meat, bears were considered a powerful and revered creature in Viking culture. The bear's fur was dense and capable of withstanding even the harshest conditions. It became an important part of Viking winter wear, offering a layer of insulation that was unmatched by any other material. Viking warriors, in particular, would wear garments made from bear fur, often as a symbol of strength and connection to the wild. These fur garments were not merely functional but also carried a deep cultural significance, embodying the Viking warriors' bond with the animal world. Wolves, too, played their part in this intricate relationship. The fur of the wolf, with its coarse undercoat and thick outer layer, was used in a similar fashion. The wolves were often hunted not only for their pelts but also for their symbolic association with the Viking warriors. Wolves were seen as noble creatures, and their pelts were often incorporated into ceremonial clothing or worn by warriors preparing for battle. The fur was carefully processed and used to make clothing that was both warm and practical. Whether used for cloaks, boots, or gloves, wolf fur provided an added layer of protection against the cold. But the Vikings did not stop at merely wearing these furs. They utilized them in nearly every aspect of their daily lives. Animal skins were used to line the interiors of their shelters, insulating the walls against the cold. The Vikings would drape the skins over their doorways and windows to keep out the chill, using the natural properties of the fur to create a barrier between the warmth inside and the bitter cold outside. These furs became integral to the construction of their homes, contributing to the insulation of the longhouses and other dwellings. For the Vikings, survival was not a matter of simply finding warmth but of mastering it. They understood that the key to surviving the long nights was not just about finding shelter or fire but about creating an environment where heat could be preserved. The fur-lined shelters and clothing they crafted were not just practical solutions to the cold, they were a testament to the Viking ability to adapt and thrive in the face of adversity. The Vikings were resourceful people who saw the land around them as a tool to be used to its fullest potential. They did not simply take what they needed from the land, they worked with it, using the resources available to them in ways that would ensure their survival through the most difficult seasons. One of the most remarkable aspects of Viking survival was their intimate knowledge of the animals they relied upon. They understood the natural world better than many realize. The Vikings were expert hunters, not just because they had superior weapons, but because they knew how to track and understand the behavior of the animals they pursued. They knew which animals were best suited for their needs at different times of the year. During the winter months, the furs of the animals they hunted became vital, not just for clothing but for their continued existence. The Vikings' use of animal furs extended beyond clothing and shelter. The skins were also used to create bedding and sleeping bags. These sleeping bags, fashioned from reindeer, bear, or wolf pelts, were essential for surviving the freezing nights when no fire was available. By wrapping themselves in the warmth of the animals, the Vikings could ensure that they would sleep through the long, cold hours of winter without succumbing to the elements. These sleeping bags were not merely items of comfort but critical survival tools that allowed the Vikings to endure when the cold became unbearable. The fur trade was also a significant aspect of Viking life. The Vikings were known to be expert traders, and animal furs were among the most valuable commodities they could offer. They traded fur with other cultures, from the Byzantines to the Franks, and this trade played a crucial role in the Viking economy. The fur not only provided warmth and insulation for the Vikings but also allowed them to accumulate wealth and expand their influence across Europe. This trade further underscored the importance of animals in Viking society. They were a source of both physical sustenance and economic power. The Vikings' relationship with animals was more than just practical, it was spiritual. Animals, particularly those whose fur they wore, were often associated with strength, courage, and survival. The bear, the wolf, the reindeer, all of these animals held symbolic significance in Viking culture. They were seen as embodiments of traits the Vikings valued: fierceness, resilience, and the ability to adapt to the harshest of conditions. By wearing the fur of these animals, the Vikings were not only protecting themselves from the cold but also channeling the strength and power of the animals themselves. This connection to the animal world was woven into the very fabric of Viking life. It was not just about survival in a practical sense, but about a deeper understanding of the natural world and the spiritual forces that governed it. The furs of the animals were not simply commodities. They were powerful symbols of the Vikings' bond with the land, the beasts that roamed it, and the harsh, unyielding forces of nature that shaped their world. Through the use of animal skins and furs, the Vikings created a system of warmth that allowed them to not only survive but thrive in one of the coldest, most unforgiving climates on Earth. The fur, carefully harvested, prepared, and crafted into garments and shelters, became the key to their survival. It was not just a practical solution to the cold but a testament to the Vikings' ingenuity, their adaptability, and their ability to work with the land to ensure that they would endure the winter's harshest nights. The fur of the animals they hunted was, in many ways, the embodiment of Viking resilience, a symbol of their enduring spirit in the face of nature's coldest trials. As the Vikings lived and breathed their survival against nature's harshest elements, they also embraced the natural world cycles with a profound understanding of time and adaptation. In the depth of winter, when darkness enveloped the land for weeks on end and the bitter winds cut through the earth like sharp knives, survival was not just about what was done in the moment. It was about long-term strategies, careful planning, and a connection to the rhythms of the earth itself. The Vikings had learned to navigate not just the landscape, but the seasons themselves, using the natural world to their advantage. They were not merely surviving, they were thriving in a world that was unforgiving, where every day felt like a battle against the elements. The winters in Scandinavia could last for up to 6 months, with cold snaps that could freeze the ground solid, making travel nearly impossible and food scarce. During this time, the Vikings had to rely on more than just their homes and their firewood. They had to plan ahead, collecting resources throughout the warmer months and storing them carefully for the winter ahead. This foresight was essential for survival. Food, for example, was not something the Vikings could rely on gathering in the dead of winter. Instead, they hunted and preserved their catch, carefully drying or salting the meat and storing it in cool, dark places. The Vikings had a unique system of preservation that allowed them to keep their food throughout the long winter months, ensuring that they had enough to eat when the world outside their homes was locked in ice. In addition to food, the Vikings had to store firewood for the winter. They would spend the warmer months gathering wood from the forests, cutting it into manageable pieces and stacking it neatly for use in the colder months. But the wood itself had to be carefully selected. Certain types of wood burned longer and hotter than others, and the Vikings understood which trees were best for making fires that would last throughout the night. Oak, beech, and ash were particularly prized, as they provided the longest-lasting embers. Pine and fir, while abundant, burned quickly and were best used for kindling or for short bursts of warmth. The Vikings' ability to gather and store resources was a crucial part of their survival strategy. They understood that the land would not always provide what they needed in the harsh winter months. The key to surviving those long nights was not just finding warmth in the moment, but making sure they had everything they needed to last. This level of preparedness required a deep understanding of the environment, an understanding that allowed them to navigate the changing seasons with relative ease. In the face of such extreme conditions, the Vikings developed a sense of self-sufficiency that was unparalleled in the ancient world. They were not simply at the mercy of the elements. They shaped the environment to their needs, adapting the land and its resources to create a sustainable way of life. In the dead of winter, when the winds howled outside and the darkness seemed to stretch on endlessly, the Vikings could rest easy knowing that they had prepared for the worst. They had anticipated the cold and had built their lives around it, knowing that their survival depended not just on reacting to the present, but on looking ahead and preparing for the future. But their connection to the land wasn't limited to practical survival strategies. The Vikings' sense of time and their understanding of the natural world extended beyond mere necessity into the realm of spirituality and myth. To them, the land, the sea, the sky, and the creatures that inhabited it were all part of a larger, interconnected world. The Vikings did not view nature as something to be conquered or dominated. Instead, they saw themselves as part of a greater cosmic order. The harsh winters, the endless cold, the nights that seemed to stretch on without end, all of these were not just challenges to be overcome. They were integral parts of the world that shaped their identity and their place in the universe. For the Vikings, the gods themselves were closely tied to the natural world. The cold, the storms, and the darkness were all manifestations of the divine forces that governed their lives. The gods were not abstract figures living in distant realms. They were active participants in the world, controlling the seasons, the weather, and the forces of nature. In the long, dark winter months, the Vikings believed that they were under the watchful eyes of these gods, who governed not only their survival but also their fate. Among the most significant gods in Viking mythology were the figures of Thor, the thunder god, and Freya, the goddess of fertility and love. Thor, associated with storms and the power of nature, was often invoked during the harsh winter months. He was seen as a protector of the people, a deity whose strength and power could help them survive the cold and the darkness. Freya, on the other hand, represented the cycles of nature, particularly the rebirth of the earth after the harsh winter. She was a symbol of hope, a reminder that the cold and the darkness of winter would eventually give way to the warmth and fertility of spring. The Vikings celebrated the changing of the seasons with elaborate festivals that marked the passage from one phase of the year to the next. These festivals, often centered around the winter solstice, were a time for the community to come together and reaffirm their bond with the natural world and the divine forces that governed it. The winter solstice, which marked the longest night of the year, was a time for the Vikings to celebrate the return of the light. They believed that the solstice symbolized the victory of the sun over the darkness and that, from this point forward, the days would gradually grow longer and the warmth of the sun would return. In this way, the Vikings' survival during the harsh winter months was not just a matter of physical endurance. It was a spiritual journey, one that involved a deep connection to the land, the animals, and the gods. The cold was not merely a physical challenge, it was a test of their strength, resilience, and faith. The Vikings did not just endure the cold, they embraced it, seeing it as an essential part of their existence. The cold of winter was a reminder of the harshness of the world, but it was also a reminder of their ability to survive, to adapt, and to overcome. As the seasons changed, and the days slowly began to grow longer, the Vikings would prepare for the arrival of spring, a time of renewal and growth. They would begin the work of planting, hunting, and rebuilding, using the resources they had stored during the winter to ensure that they were ready for the challenges of the coming year. The cycle of survival, of living in harmony with the natural world, continued, and the Vikings' connection to the land remained as strong as ever. This deep relationship with the seasons, the gods, and the land itself was what allowed the Vikings to survive in a world that was at times merciless. It was not just their physical prowess, their tools, or their fire that kept them alive. It was their understanding of the world around them, their ability to work with the land, to plan ahead, and to tap into the spiritual forces that governed their lives. The cold, the darkness, and the harsh conditions were not just obstacles to be overcome, they were part of the fabric of Viking life, shaping their culture, their beliefs, and their survival. The ability of the Vikings to endure the freezing nights of Scandinavia was not solely reliant on physical tools and strategies, but also on their resilience and adaptability. One of the most striking aspects of Viking survival in the frigid winters was their deep understanding of the principles of heat, insulation, and body mechanics. In a world where even the most seasoned warriors could be brought to their knees by a long, unforgiving winter, the Vikings developed a keen sense of how to work with their environment rather than fight against it. This knowledge was passed down through generations, honed through necessity, and became an essential part of their culture, identity, and survival in the harsh Northlands. It wasn't just about layering clothes or building strong shelters. The Vikings knew that to truly survive, they needed to harness every possible source of warmth and comfort, even those that were seemingly insignificant. Among the most ingenious aspects of Viking winter survival was their use of what we might call micro-survival techniques. These methods focused on conserving and amplifying the warmth already present, rather than relying solely on external sources like fire. One of the most notable techniques involved the strategic use of body heat, not just for warmth, but as a means to create a self-sustaining heat system. The Vikings understood the human body as a powerful resource. They realized that even the coldest nights could be survived by using one another's body heat. In longhouses, where extended families often lived together, the close proximity of the people inside would naturally generate warmth. The Vikings would gather close to one another, sleeping in communal spaces, sharing their body heat to stave off the chill of the night. This practice was particularly important when fire was unavailable, such as during storms or when fuel was running low. The warmth of the human body was not something to be underestimated. In the dead of winter, it became a vital part of the Vikings' survival strategy. However, body heat alone would not always be enough to keep the cold at bay, especially when the temperature outside plunged to unimaginable lows. This is where the Vikings' resourcefulness came into play. They developed a clever method of trapping heat within their living spaces, ensuring that even a small amount of warmth could go a long way. To this end, the Vikings used the concept of a thermal envelope, the idea that the warmer air inside their homes could be contained, preventing it from escaping and allowing it to circulate. Their homes were designed to create as tight a seal as possible, minimizing the loss of warmth. The walls of Viking longhouses, for instance, were thick and insulated with materials like sod and animal hides. The roofs, slanted to allow snow to slide off, were also constructed in such a way as to prevent heat from escaping. It was not just about the fire, it was about creating an environment where the heat could be contained and spread, ensuring the survival of those within. In addition to insulation, the Vikings used specific techniques to amplify and maintain warmth over long periods of time. They would often employ heat-retaining materials in their bedding and sleeping arrangements. The use of fur-lined blankets, thick hides, and straw-filled mattresses helped to trap body heat throughout the night. In a time before modern heating systems, these simple yet effective techniques made all the difference. The Vikings, with their deep connection to the land and its natural resources, had learned to maximize the warmth they generated, creating conditions in their homes that were sustainable even in the dead of winter. But the Vikings' winter survival strategies were not limited to what they did within the confines of their homes. They also understood the importance of maintaining their physical health during the cold months. The cold, while a constant threat, could also be a powerful ally. The Vikings knew that in order to stay warm, the body had to be kept active. Physical activity, especially during the coldest months, was crucial for keeping the body's internal heat regulated. The Vikings would engage in regular exercise and movement to ensure that their blood circulated effectively, helping to ward off the effects of the biting cold. Exercise was not just about keeping the body warm, however. It was also about maintaining mental sharpness. The Vikings, who were no strangers to the rigors of battle, understood that strength and focus were necessary for survival in the harsh winter months. The mental and emotional toll of the long nights could be just as difficult to manage as the physical challenges. Isolation, fear, and despair were very real threats in the cold, dark landscape. The Vikings kept their minds sharp through social interaction, storytelling, and communal work. They understood that the battle against the cold was not only fought with warmth, but with camaraderie, resilience, and mental fortitude. The communal lifestyle, where families and extended kin would come together to weather the storm, provided not just warmth but a sense of solidarity that was critical to surviving the harsh winters. Furthermore, the Vikings used their knowledge of the surrounding environment to help them manage the cold. As skilled hunters, they knew how to track and hunt animals during the winter months, ensuring they had a steady supply of food to sustain them. They understood that while the cold might make hunting more difficult, it also made animals more vulnerable and easier to track. Hunting became not only a means of providing food but also a way to stay active and engaged with the land. They would use the winter months to gather meat, fish, and game, preserving it for the colder nights. The process of smoking, salting, and drying meat ensured that food could be stored for months at a time, keeping the Vikings nourished even when the world outside seemed barren. In the darkest days of winter, when the night stretched on for what seemed like eternity, the Vikings also relied on the natural light they could find. The long winter nights, though bleak and oppressive, were not entirely devoid of light. The moon, especially during the winter months, cast a soft glow over the land, and the stars would twinkle brightly in the clear skies. The Vikings saw these moments of celestial light as signs of hope and guidance, even in the coldest times. They often used the stars to navigate, helping them find their way during travels or hunts. The interplay between the dark and the light, the cold and the warmth, was deeply ingrained in Viking culture. They didn't see the darkness of winter as a negative force to be fought against, but as part of the cycle of life that they had learned to work with. In this sense, they had made peace with the cold, understanding that it was a necessary part of life, as integral to their existence as the warmth of summer. The Vikings were not merely enduring the winter, they were thriving in it. Their survival was not simply about dealing with the cold, it was about adapting to it in every sense. From the way they designed their homes to the way they layered their clothing, from the foods they preserved to the social structures they built, the Vikings had mastered the art of living in the cold. They turned what many would see as a harsh and hostile environment into a challenge to be met with strength, ingenuity, and unity. Through a combination of physical resilience, resourcefulness, and mental toughness, the Vikings developed the survival strategies that allowed them to withstand the bitter cold and long nights of the north. They did not just fight against the elements, but worked with them, learning to maximize the warmth they could generate, conserve energy, and preserve what was most vital for their survival. They were not only warriors in battle but in life itself, facing the extreme challenges of the winter with a fierce determination and a profound understanding of the natural world around them. As the Vikings weathered the long and brutal winters, they discovered that their ability to endure the harsh conditions depended not just on physical survival techniques but on an inner strength cultivated through centuries of cultural evolution. The cold, dark nights of Scandinavia could be overwhelming, both physically and mentally. However, it was during these long nights that the true resilience of the Viking spirit was tested. Their survival was not simply about enduring the elements, but about thriving in an environment that demanded ingenuity, toughness, and perseverance. The way the Vikings approached the cold was a reflection of their overall mindset, one that saw adversity not as an obstacle but as a challenge to be conquered. In Viking culture, the battle against the cold was not just a practical endeavor, it was deeply woven into their belief systems, social structures, and rituals. For the Vikings, life was a constant series of trials, and each challenge, whether in the form of an enemy or the unforgiving winter, was an opportunity to prove one's worth. The harshness of the cold seemed to symbolize the unpredictable and often dangerous nature of life itself. To survive in this world, one had to be resourceful, brave, and adaptable. These qualities were instilled from an early age in Viking children, and they became the foundation of the Viking worldview. One of the most profound aspects of Viking survival during the winter months was their mental fortitude. In the darkness of winter, when the sun barely rose above the horizon and the winds howled through the trees, the Viking mind had to remain sharp. The isolation of the winter months often led to a sense of claustrophobia and dread. Yet, the Vikings approached these times with a different perspective. Instead of retreating into despair, they embraced the dark months as a time for reflection, storytelling, and forging stronger bonds with their kin. Winter was seen as a time for the mind and soul to grow, not just for the body to endure. Central to Viking culture was the importance of storytelling. In the long, cold nights when the wind would whistle through the cracks in the walls and the firelight flickered dimly, the Vikings would gather around the hearth to tell tales. These stories were not just entertainment but a way to keep the spirit of the people alive. The sagas, which chronicled the lives of legendary figures and ancestors, were passed down from generation to generation, and they played a critical role in shaping the Viking identity. These tales of heroes and gods were not just stories, they were blueprints for living, illustrating the virtues of courage, loyalty, and perseverance in the face of adversity. The stories were more than just a way to pass the time. They were a way to teach and reinforce the values of Viking society. The sagas told of warriors who fought against insurmountable odds, who survived harsh winters, who endured betrayal and hardship but always found a way to rise above it. These tales gave the Vikings a sense of purpose and identity in a world that often seemed indifferent to their existence. The cold winters were not something to fear, but a test of one's will, and the sagas provided a framework through which the Vikings could understand and face these challenges. In addition to the power of storytelling, the Vikings' connection to their gods and spirituality was also a vital part of their mental resilience. In the dark winter months, when the sun was a distant memory, the Vikings looked to their deities for guidance, strength, and protection. The Viking gods were not abstract concepts, they were seen as powerful forces that shaped the world around them. Thor, the god of thunder, was particularly revered during the winter. His strength, courage, and ability to weather storms were qualities that resonated with the Viking people. Thor's power was seen as a metaphor for the Viking warrior spirit, the ability to face the fury of nature with bravery and endurance. The rituals and sacrifices dedicated to the gods were an integral part of Viking life. These acts of devotion were not only meant to appease the gods but to reinforce the sense of community and shared purpose. During the long winter nights, when the cold threatened to seep into the very bones of the people, these rituals acted as a reminder that they were part of something greater than themselves. The gods, ancestors, and the community were all interconnected, and their collective strength provided the support necessary to endure the harshest conditions. Moreover, the Vikings' social structure was crucial to their survival. The tight-knit nature of Viking communities meant that everyone played a role in ensuring the group's well-being. Whether it was hunting, gathering, cooking, or crafting, every member of the community had a part to play in facing the challenges of the cold. This sense of unity was essential, as the Vikings understood that no one person could survive the winter alone. It was only through cooperation, mutual support, and shared responsibility that they could make it through the long, dark months. The communal lifestyle fostered an incredible sense of solidarity. During the darkest days of winter, when the wind howled outside and the snow piled high against the walls, the Vikings huddled together. They worked together to keep their homes warm, their bellies full, and their minds sharp. The hearth was at the center of their lives, and it was not just a physical source of warmth but a symbol of the collective spirit of the Viking people. The warmth of the fire was shared by all, and in this warmth, the bonds of family and kin were strengthened. Furthermore, the Vikings used the winter months as a time to prepare for the coming year. While others might have viewed the cold months as a time to retreat, the Vikings saw them as an opportunity to plan, to strategize, and to ensure that they were ready for whatever the next season might bring. They used the winter to sharpen their tools, repair their weapons, and create new ones. This proactive approach was integral to their survival. They knew that the seasons would not wait for them to be ready. They had to make sure they were always prepared, regardless of the circumstances. Physical endurance and mental resilience were not mutually exclusive in Viking culture. The Vikings recognized that the body and mind were deeply connected, and they worked to strengthen both. In addition to the physical preparations they made for the winter months, they also maintained a rigorous mental discipline. The isolation and darkness of winter were not just challenges to survive but opportunities to cultivate inner strength. The Vikings would not let the cold and the dark consume them. Instead, they found ways to work with these forces, drawing upon their inner reserves of strength, their spiritual beliefs, and their communal ties to maintain their focus and their drive. In this way, the Vikings developed a philosophy of survival that was not about passive endurance but active engagement with their environment. The cold was not an enemy to be fought off, but a force to be understood and worked with. The winters might have been long and harsh, but they were also a season for growth of the body, the mind, and the spirit. The Vikings had learned that survival was not just about facing adversity head-on but about adapting to it, using every resource available, and finding strength in the collective spirit. By facing the winter with this mindset, the Vikings ensured their survival not just through fire and shelter, but through the strength of their will, the bonds they shared, and the beliefs that guided them. The cold nights of winter became not just a physical challenge, but a spiritual one, an opportunity to demonstrate the resilience, courage, and unity that were the hallmarks of Viking society. They did not merely survive the winter, they thrived in it, finding meaning and strength in every cold and dark moment. While much of Viking survival in the frigid winters of Scandinavia was focused on staying warm and conserving energy, one of the most ingenious aspects of their ability to thrive in such a harsh climate was their understanding of movement and the use of limited resources. The Vikings knew that their success did not come solely from shelter, fire, or insulation. It also depended on the ability to keep moving, to remain active, and to engage with their environment in a way that maximized the warmth they could generate. In a world where the cold could freeze the ground solid and snow could blanket the earth for months, the Vikings understood the importance of movement, both for survival and for psychological well-being. Winter, with its unyielding darkness and cold, often presented the Vikings with a mental challenge as much as a physical one. In these conditions, it was easy for isolation and despair to creep in, as long nights stretched into endless days of cold, darkness, and stillness. The Vikings knew, however, that their mental resilience depended on their ability to stay active and engaged. Movement was not just a matter of survival but a matter of maintaining morale. In Viking culture, the spirit of adventure, exploration, and activity was ever present, even during the most challenging months. This drive to remain active was a key element of their ability to endure the winter months. One of the ways the Vikings kept moving during the winter was through the practice of hunting. The frozen landscapes of Scandinavia, though harsh, were rich with game, and the Vikings knew how to track and hunt animals in these conditions. While many would assume that hunting would be difficult or even impossible in such frigid environments, the Vikings had a profound understanding of the landscape and the behavior of the animals they pursued. During the winter months, they would hunt for reindeer, elk, wild boar, and other game that roamed the forests. They used the snow to their advantage, tracking animals through the fresh powder, where their footprints could be easily seen. The cold, while challenging, also made the animals more predictable, as they would often seek shelter in the same areas, giving the Vikings a distinct advantage. This hunting was not only crucial for providing food, but it also allowed the Vikings to stay active and engaged with the land. The physical activity required to hunt in the winter, trudging through deep snow, tracking animals, and bringing down large game, helped to keep the body warm and the blood flowing. It was a way to stay sharp, to continue moving and working, and to prevent the feelings of stagnation that might otherwise set in during the long, dark nights. The hunt itself was a test of endurance, and like many aspects of Viking life, it was seen as both a practical necessity and a test of strength and skill. In addition to hunting, the Vikings also relied on fishing to supplement their food stores during the winter months. Fishing in winter might seem an unlikely activity, but the Vikings had perfected techniques for ice fishing that allowed them to continue harvesting fish even in freezing conditions. In the northern parts of Scandinavia, where lakes and rivers would freeze solid, the Vikings would cut holes in the ice and use specialized tools to fish through the cold, hard surface. This method not only provided food but kept the Vikings active during the long winter months, ensuring that they maintained their physical health and mental clarity. Fishing and hunting were not just about keeping the body moving, however. They were also an important part of the Viking way of life, deeply connected to their relationship with the natural world. For the Vikings, the land, the sea, and the animals that roamed them were not just sources of food but sacred elements that required respect and understanding. These activities were steeped in spiritual significance, as they were seen as ways of engaging with the forces of nature and with the gods themselves. To hunt and fish successfully was not just about skill but also about honoring the natural world and its cycles. The physical activity that came with hunting and fishing was also complemented by another important aspect of Viking life: their physical training. The Vikings were not just farmers, traders, and sailors. They were warriors, and their survival depended on maintaining physical fitness, even in the dead of winter. During the colder months, when combat might be less frequent, they still practiced their skills, either by training with weapons or by engaging in physical exercise. They understood that strength, agility, and endurance were essential not only for fighting but for surviving the harsh conditions of their environment. Physical fitness was a way of staying sharp and ready for any challenges that might arise. Even in the dead of winter, the Vikings kept their bodies active, lifting weights, practicing swordplay, and engaging in other forms of exercise. This commitment to physical fitness allowed them to maintain their strength and stamina throughout the winter, ensuring that they could face any threat or challenge with confidence. This physical training was not just about preparing for battle, it was about preparing for life. The Vikings understood that the harshness of the North required resilience, both physically and mentally. Staying active was a means of fortifying both the body and the mind. Another aspect of Viking survival during the winter months was the importance of resourcefulness and the efficient use of materials. The Vikings were experts in making the most of what they had, particularly when it came to fuel and shelter. During the winter, firewood became a precious commodity, and the Vikings understood that they could not afford to waste it. They would gather firewood carefully, using every available resource to ensure they had enough to last the long, cold nights. Even the most modest of shelters could be made to feel warm and inviting through careful use of firewood, insulation, and the strategic placement of heat sources. Vikings would burn wood, peat, and animal dung when necessary to keep their homes warm, ensuring that they had enough fuel to last through the most severe of winter storms. Vikings also developed ingenious methods for conserving warmth and energy. One of the most notable innovations was their use of heated stones. They would heat stones in the fire and then place them in their beds or use them to heat their homes. The stones retained heat for hours, slowly releasing it throughout the night, ensuring that the Vikings could sleep comfortably even when the outside temperature plummeted. This clever use of heat retention was just one example of how the Vikings worked with their environment to make the most of their resources. While the Vikings' survival strategies were highly practical, they were also rooted in their spiritual beliefs. They did not simply see the cold, the hunt, or physical exercise as tasks to be done. They saw them as integral parts of their connection to the world and the divine forces that shaped their lives. Every act, from hunting to warming their homes, was imbued with spiritual significance. The Vikings believed that their survival during the harsh winter months was not just a matter of skill and strength, but also a reflection of their favor with the gods. They believed that the gods watched over them, guiding their actions and protecting them from the worst of the cold. In the end, the Vikings' ability to survive the freezing winters of Scandinavia was not just a matter of physical resilience. It was about maintaining their connection to the land, to their community, and to the divine. Their resourcefulness, strength, and tenacity in the face of such extreme conditions were the result of centuries of cultural evolution. The Vikings did not just endure the cold, they mastered it, using every tool at their disposal, from physical activity to clever techniques for warmth, to ensure their survival and prosperity in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. The harsh winters of Scandinavia were not only a test of the Vikings' physical endurance but also a challenge to their ingenuity. The environment they lived in demanded constant adaptation, resourcefulness, and the ability to turn even the most difficult situations into opportunities for survival. It was in these long, cold months that the Vikings showcased some of their most innovative methods for combating the freezing nights. Beyond just layering clothing or building shelters, they developed ingenious systems to stay warm, keep their homes habitable, and ensure that they could continue to function and thrive despite the relentless cold. One of the most remarkable aspects of Viking survival during these winters was their use of natural materials. The Vikings were expert craftsmen, and they applied their skills to create everything from clothing to tools, weapons, and even their living spaces. The materials they used were sourced directly from the land, and they understood how to make the most of everything around them. Animal hides, wood, stone, and even moss were utilized in the construction of their homes and the crafting of their clothing. This resourcefulness wasn't just about getting by. It was about building a sustainable way of life in a harsh environment where survival could often feel like a battle against nature itself. In terms of construction, Viking longhouses were designed with the harsh winters in mind. They were typically built with thick walls made of timber, stone, and sod, which helped insulate them against the cold. The roofs were steeply pitched to allow snow to slide off easily, preventing it from accumulating and adding weight that could damage the structure. The walls of the longhouse were lined with animal pelts and hides, which served as additional insulation. These materials, while simple, were incredibly effective at trapping warmth inside. The Vikings were skilled at maximizing the heat from their fires, ensuring that every inch of their living space could be kept warm without excessive fuel consumption. This was especially important during the long, dark winters when resources like firewood could be scarce. Inside these homes, the Vikings also developed ways to conserve heat through clever design. Central hearths, often located in the middle of the home, were the heart of their heating system. The fire was not only used for warmth but also for cooking and lighting. The hearth was carefully constructed to optimize the flow of heat, and the smoke would often be channeled out through a vent or chimney to prevent the home from filling with smoke. The Vikings were pioneers in creating systems that allowed them to heat their homes efficiently while using the smallest amount of firewood possible. In the coldest months, the hearth became the center of life, a place for the family to gather, tell stories, eat, and sleep. Even in the depths of winter, when the fire was the only source of heat, the Vikings knew that maximizing its efficiency was essential. They used a variety of techniques to ensure that the fire would last as long as possible, especially during the night. By building the fire in a way that allowed it to burn slowly, the Vikings could ensure that it would continue to provide warmth for many hours without needing to be constantly fed. This technique, known as a long burn, involved carefully stacking logs in a way that allowed air to circulate, creating a slow, controlled fire that would last through the night. Viking clothing, too, was designed with the winter in mind. The Vikings were known for their ability to craft warm, functional clothing from animal pelts, wool, and linen. Their garments were designed not just to keep out the cold but to allow for movement and flexibility. They would layer animal furs, woolen tunics, and leather boots to create clothing that could withstand even the most brutal temperatures. The fur from animals like reindeer, wolves, and bears provided the necessary insulation to keep the Vikings warm in sub-zero temperatures. The outer layers of clothing were often waterproof, made from leather or oiled fabric, to protect against rain and snow. Gloves, hats, and boots were all crafted with the same attention to detail, ensuring that every part of the body was protected from the elements. In addition to the clothing they wore, the Vikings also employed practical methods to keep themselves warm while sleeping. They used thick woolen blankets, furs, and straw-filled mattresses to insulate themselves against the cold ground. The Vikings understood the importance of creating a warm, comfortable sleeping environment to ensure that they could rest and recover for the challenges of the next day. Even when their homes were small and the fire was low, these layers of bedding helped retain body heat, making the long, freezing nights more bearable. These sleeping arrangements were particularly important when the Vikings had to venture outside in the winter to hunt or travel, where every bit of warmth and energy saved would be essential. Another ingenious aspect of Viking survival was their use of ice to preserve food. In an era before refrigeration, the Vikings had to find ways to store food during the long winter months, when fresh food was scarce. One of the methods they used was ice storage. The Vikings would often dig pits or build small ice houses, which they would line with straw or moss to insulate them. They would then pack the food into these ice pits, ensuring that it would stay fresh for months. The cold temperatures of winter provided a natural refrigerator, allowing the Vikings to store fish, meat, and dairy products. This method of food preservation was not only practical but essential for survival. It ensured that they would have enough food to sustain them through the darkest months when hunting and fishing were difficult, and the land offered fewer resources. Vikings also developed techniques for food preservation that went beyond freezing. They were adept at smoking and salting meat to keep it from spoiling. During the fall, when hunting was most successful, the Vikings would smoke and dry large quantities of meat, which could be stored and eaten throughout the winter. Salt was also used to preserve fish and other perishable foods. This allowed the Vikings to have a steady supply of food even when the weather made it difficult to hunt or fish. They had a profound understanding of how to stretch their resources and make them last, ensuring that they would never be caught off guard by scarcity. The Viking diet itself was another testament to their ingenuity in the face of winter. While the cold months might have been difficult for farming, the Vikings found ways to grow and harvest crops that were well suited to the northern climate. Barley, oats, and rye were common staples, as these grains could withstand the cold and were used to make bread, porridge, and ale. In addition to grains, the Vikings also grew root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions, which could be stored through the winter. They supplemented their diet with fish, meat, and wild game, ensuring that they had a diverse and nutrient-rich diet even during the darkest months of the year. Even in the midst of the harshest winters, the Vikings found ways to continue their work, their trade, and their community life. They did not allow the cold to dictate the course of their lives. Instead, they adapted, finding creative ways to stay warm, feed themselves, and keep their homes habitable. Their ability to utilize every resource at their disposal, from firewood and animal pelts to the ice and snow around them, ensured that they could weather the most brutal winters with resilience and ingenuity. The Viking way of life was built on the idea of working with nature rather than fighting against it. Their use of natural materials, efficient heating methods, clever food preservation techniques, and practical clothing allowed them to survive, and even thrive, in one of the coldest climates in the world. In many ways, the Vikings' approach to winter was symbolic of their larger worldview. They saw the challenges of nature not as obstacles to be avoided but as tests to be conquered. And in every challenge, they found a way to adapt, innovate, and continue their way of life. As the long, dark nights of winter continued to envelop the Viking lands, the Vikings' resilience was not simply reliant on the physical aspects of survival, nor was it limited to the ingenuity and resourcefulness they applied to their immediate environment. One of the more profound aspects of their ability to thrive in the cold was their deeply ingrained cultural practices, which helped them manage the hardships of winter, both mentally and socially. In the absence of modern technologies and comforts, the Vikings found solace, strength, and unity in their communal activities, rituals, and traditions. These practices not only helped them endure but also fostered a sense of hope and continuity that kept their spirits strong during the darkest months of the year. One of the most significant cultural practices during the winter months was the Viking tradition of feasts and communal gatherings. The harsh conditions of winter often isolated the Vikings in their homes, making social interactions scarce. However, during the colder months, families and communities would come together to celebrate, share food, and renew their bonds. These gatherings were not only essential for maintaining social ties, but they also served as a powerful antidote to the psychological strain that could arise from the isolation and darkness of winter. Feasts and celebrations were not just times for eating and drinking. They were also moments of storytelling, where the Viking community would gather around the hearth and recount tales of past victories, legendary heroes, and the exploits of their ancestors. These stories, often passed down orally from one generation to the next, were not merely entertainment but a vital part of Viking culture. They helped to reinforce the values of bravery, strength, and honor that were central to their way of life. In the midst of winter, when the world outside was frozen and dark, these stories of heroism and adventure reminded the Vikings of the larger world and their place in it. The Viking sagas were filled with tales of warriors and gods who faced adversity and triumphed against seemingly impossible odds. For the Vikings, these stories were a source of inspiration, reminding them that the cold and dark of winter were temporary trials to be overcome. Just as the heroes in the sagas endured hardship, so too could they. These stories of struggle and resilience were a means of reinforcing their collective identity and ensuring that the spirit of their ancestors lived on, even in the harshest of times. The act of storytelling also helped to strengthen the Viking sense of community. During the winter months, when families were often confined to their longhouses, the bond between individuals became even more vital. Gathering around the fire to share stories was not just about entertainment. It was about reinforcing a sense of belonging and connection. These moments of shared experience were crucial for maintaining the psychological well-being of the group. The long winter nights, which could otherwise lead to feelings of isolation or depression, were transformed into opportunities for togetherness and unity. In addition to feasting and storytelling, the Vikings also took part in various rituals and religious practices to help them endure the winter. The Viking religion, with its pantheon of gods and goddesses, was intricately linked to the natural world, and many of their rituals were designed to honor the forces of nature and seek favor from the gods. The winter solstice, which marked the shortest day and longest night of the year, was a particularly important time for these rituals. For the Vikings, the solstice symbolized the triumph of light over darkness, a time when the sun's return was eagerly awaited after the long, dark winter months. During the solstice, the Vikings would celebrate with large feasts and sacrifices to the gods, particularly to Sol, the goddess of the sun. They believed that the solstice marked the beginning of the sun's return, a time when the days would begin to lengthen and warmth would once again return to the land. These celebrations were not only a way to honor their gods but also a way to instill hope in the hearts of the people. The belief in the sun's return was deeply ingrained in Viking culture, and the solstice celebrations were a way to remind the community that, no matter how long or dark the winter seemed, the light would eventually return. The rituals surrounding the solstice were marked by a sense of renewal and rebirth. The Vikings believed that the cold, dark winter was a necessary part of the cycle of life, but they also saw it as a time for reflection and preparation for the coming year. During these rituals, the Vikings would offer sacrifices, both to appease the gods and to ensure a good harvest in the months ahead. These sacrifices were often made at sacred sites, such as groves or stone circles, where the Vikings believed the gods were closest. The rituals were not just about appeasing the divine, they were also a way for the community to come together, reaffirm their values, and look forward to the future. Beyond religious rituals, the Vikings also engaged in practical forms of preparation for the future during the winter months. These preparations were not limited to material things such as food and shelter, they also included mental and emotional preparation for the challenges of the coming year. Winter was a time for reflection, for setting goals, and for readying oneself for the new season. It was a time to look back on the successes and failures of the past year and to plan for the future. The cold months allowed for a different kind of work, one that involved reflection and internal growth. The Vikings used the time to sharpen their skills, prepare their weapons, and plan their next voyages or raids. They also worked to strengthen their personal relationships, often using the winter months to solidify bonds with family, neighbors, and allies. These preparations ensured that, when the thaw came and spring arrived, they would be ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Perhaps one of the most important cultural practices for the Vikings during the winter months was the fostering of a sense of community. In a world where survival depended on cooperation and mutual support, the Vikings understood the importance of maintaining strong ties to one another. The longhouses, where extended families lived, were not just places of shelter but centers of communal life. They were places where the bonds of kinship were reinforced, where everyone had a role to play, and where each person contributed to the survival of the group. The winter months were an opportunity for the Vikings to come together, to work side by side, and to ensure that no one was left behind. These bonds were not only social but also deeply spiritual. The Vikings believed that their survival during the harsh winters was not only a reflection of their own strength but also of the favor of the gods and the strength of their community. The collective effort to endure the winter, to share resources, to help one another, and to keep hope alive, was as much a spiritual endeavor as a physical one. The long winter nights, when isolation could have led to despair, were instead transformed into moments of spiritual connection, reinforcing the sense of unity that was so integral to Viking life. The role of women in Viking society during the winter months cannot be overlooked either. While men were often away on raids or exploring, women were the backbone of Viking communities during the winter. They were responsible for managing the household, preserving food, and maintaining the warmth of the home. Women were the keepers of knowledge, passed down through generations, about how to prepare for the cold and make the most of limited resources. They were skilled in tasks such as weaving, spinning, and cooking, ensuring that the family was well provided for even in the harshest conditions. Their work ensured the physical survival of the community, while their leadership helped maintain the social and emotional well-being of their families. The winter months also offered an opportunity for children to learn and grow. They would spend time with their families, learning essential skills and stories that would help them survive in the world. Children learned from their parents and elders, picking up lessons about resilience, community, and survival. The bond between generations was crucial, and it was through these shared experiences and teachings that the Vikings ensured their culture and traditions would live on. In conclusion, the Vikings' ability to survive and thrive during the long, harsh winters was not only a matter of physical endurance or material resourcefulness. It was also deeply tied to their cultural practices, which allowed them to navigate the psychological and social challenges of winter. Feasts, storytelling, rituals, and community bonding helped the Vikings maintain hope and strength through the darkest months. Their resilience was not just a matter of surviving the cold but of creating a space where their culture, values, and relationships could endure, ensuring that the Viking way of life would continue for generations to come. As winter settled over the Viking lands, the cold and isolation did not deter the Vikings from their pursuit of knowledge and wisdom. The harsh conditions of the season, far from discouraging the Vikings, became a time for reflection, learning, and the preservation of knowledge. The winter months were a period when the Vikings would turn inward, focusing on self-improvement, skill building, and intellectual pursuits that would prepare them for the challenges of the coming year. This commitment to learning was integral to their survival in a world that demanded not only physical strength but also mental acuity. One of the key aspects of Viking life during the winter was the pursuit of storytelling and oral tradition. The long, dark nights created the perfect environment for the Vikings to come together, share stories, and pass down their knowledge. Storytelling was not just a form of entertainment, it was a vital means of preserving history, culture, and wisdom. The sagas, epic tales of gods, heroes, and legendary figures, were recited by bards or elders around the hearth. These stories were filled with lessons on bravery, loyalty, leadership, and survival, all of which were essential for a Viking in the harsh northern environment. The sagas were more than just narratives, they were blueprints for life. They helped to shape the Viking worldview and reinforce the values that guided their actions. Through these tales, the Vikings learned about their ancestors, about the triumphs and failures that had shaped their culture, and about the gods who watched over them. These stories were also a way for the Vikings to connect with their past, to honor their ancestors, and to ensure that their legacy would live on. By recounting these tales, the Vikings reaffirmed their identity as a people bound by a shared history and set of values. In addition to the sagas, the Vikings also made efforts to preserve practical knowledge during the winter months. Survival in such a harsh climate demanded not only physical strength but also a deep understanding of the natural world. The Vikings were excellent observers of the environment around them, and their knowledge of the land, the seasons, and the animals was passed down from one generation to the next. During the winter months, when they were often confined indoors, this knowledge was shared and refined. The skills necessary for hunting, fishing, navigation, and farming were taught to the younger generations, ensuring that these essential abilities would not be lost. One of the most important aspects of Viking knowledge was their understanding of navigation. The Vikings were legendary seafarers, and their ability to navigate the seas allowed them to explore vast distances, trade with distant cultures, and raid foreign lands. During the winter, when they were not out on the open sea, they would use the time to refine their navigational skills. This often involved studying the stars, learning to read the winds, and understanding the currents. The Vikings' ability to navigate by the stars was a key factor in their success as explorers, and this knowledge was passed down through oral tradition, ensuring that each new generation would be ready to embark on new journeys when the weather warmed. Viking seafaring knowledge also extended to shipbuilding. The construction of longships was a craft that required great skill and expertise, and during the winter months, shipbuilders would often work on repairs or even build new vessels. The longship, with its sleek design and shallow draft, was perfect for navigating the rough, icy waters of the north. Shipbuilding was a specialized skill that was passed down through generations, and winter provided the ideal time to practice this craft, perfecting the techniques necessary to build vessels that could withstand the toughest conditions. Another area of knowledge that the Vikings valued was their expertise in warfare. The Viking Age was marked by frequent raids and battles, and the ability to fight effectively in a variety of conditions was essential to their survival. During the winter months, when they were not engaged in active combat, the Vikings would spend time sharpening their martial skills. This included training in the use of weapons such as swords, axes, and spears, as well as practicing combat techniques. The Vikings were fierce warriors, and their success in battle was due not only to their physical strength but also to their strategic thinking and tactical prowess. The Vikings' knowledge of warfare was also informed by their spiritual beliefs. They believed that the gods, particularly Odin, the god of war and wisdom, had a direct influence on the outcome of battles. The Vikings would seek guidance from the gods through rituals and sacrifices, hoping to gain favor and strength for the battles ahead. During the winter months, when the days were darkest, these spiritual practices were particularly important, as they provided a sense of connection to the divine and a source of strength during times of hardship. This connection to the gods helped to inspire courage and resolve in the Vikings, reminding them that they were not fighting alone but with the guidance of powerful, benevolent forces. Even in the winter months, when the Vikings were not out on raids or voyages, they continued to hone their combat skills in preparation for the warmer months when their warbands would take to the seas once again. They practiced with weapons, trained in combat tactics, and strategized about future campaigns. The Vikings were known for their fierce fighting spirit, and this was nurtured during the long winter months through rigorous training, preparation, and spiritual reflection. Beyond physical and combat training, the Vikings also placed great importance on mental and emotional resilience. The harsh winters of Scandinavia were not only a test of physical endurance but also a challenge to the mind and spirit. The darkness, isolation, and cold could take a toll on the psyche, and the Vikings recognized the importance of maintaining mental fortitude during these long months. Much of this resilience was cultivated through their spiritual practices and their strong sense of community. The rituals, feasts, and storytelling helped to maintain hope, strength, and unity during the winter, ensuring that the Vikings would emerge from the cold months ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The Vikings' understanding of mental resilience also extended to their approach to hardships in life. Their culture was one that embraced adversity as a natural part of existence. Suffering and hardship were not seen as burdens but as opportunities for growth and strength. This mindset was crucial for surviving the difficult winter months, when isolation and deprivation could easily lead to despair. The Vikings were taught from a young age to face challenges head-on, to be brave in the face of danger, and to never give up. This mental toughness was as important as their physical strength and survival skills, and it was an integral part of their ability to endure the hardships of winter. In the end, the Vikings' success during the long, cold winters of Scandinavia was not just a matter of physical endurance or survival skills. It was about a comprehensive approach to life that included a commitment to learning, the preservation of knowledge, the cultivation of mental and emotional resilience, and the reinforcement of cultural identity through storytelling and communal activities. The winter months were not just a time of hardship but also a time of growth, learning, and preparation for the future. The Vikings understood that survival in such a harsh environment required not only physical strength but also mental acuity, adaptability, and a deep sense of community and connection to their traditions. Through their commitment to knowledge, both practical and spiritual, the Vikings ensured that they could not only survive the winter but emerge from it stronger, wiser, and more prepared for the challenges of the coming year. As the winter months wore on, the Vikings' ability to adapt and endure was not only reflected in their physical and mental resilience but also in their capacity to innovate and improve upon existing methods of survival. The long, harsh winters of Scandinavia demanded constant evolution, and the Vikings did not rest on their laurels. They used the cold season as an opportunity to refine their strategies, explore new solutions to age-old problems, and enhance their chances of survival through clever innovation. It was during these long nights and frozen days that they honed the skills, tools, and techniques that allowed them to thrive in one of the harshest climates on Earth. One of the key innovations that became crucial to Viking survival was the development and refinement of their clothing. While the basic structure of Viking clothing had remained fairly consistent, the way in which they adapted it to the extreme cold was a product of years of trial, error, and ingenuity. Clothing was not just a form of protection, It was a complex system designed to trap warmth, wick away moisture, and allow for freedom of movement. Viking tunics and trousers were often made from wool, which, despite its rough texture, was highly effective at insulating and retaining heat even when wet. Animal pelts, such as those from reindeer and wolves, were carefully fashioned into cloaks and coats, providing an extra layer of warmth. However, it was the meticulous process of layering these materials, along with the addition of leather, fur, and other natural substances, that allowed the Vikings to create highly functional, multi-layered garments. Additionally, the Vikings would frequently wear knitted gloves, socks, and hats, all of which were crafted to suit the harsh environment. These knitted garments were particularly important in keeping extremities warm, which was essential in preventing frostbite during extended periods outside. One of the innovations that helped Viking survival was the use of insulating layers made from natural materials such as moss, which could be stuffed between layers of clothing to provide additional warmth. This resourceful use of materials ensured that the Vikings remained as warm as possible, even during the most extreme weather conditions. While clothing was a major focus of innovation, the Vikings also looked to improve their tools and methods for heating their homes. Longhouses, where entire families lived, were designed to withstand the intense cold and provide a sustainable living environment. The Viking longhouses were typically constructed with thick wooden walls, covered with sod or thatch to help insulate them against the biting cold. The roofs were steeply pitched to prevent snow accumulation, which could weigh down the structure and cause collapse. Inside, the hearths were carefully designed to provide maximum warmth. Viking hearths were often centrally located in the middle of the home, ensuring that the heat would disperse throughout the dwelling. In some longhouses, Viking families created a clever system of heated floors using stones and fire.